welcome to the AT&T Cyber Threat Report for October 27th, 2011. Joining us today, we have Keith Epstein. Keith is an AT&T attorney, and he also he gives counsel to the enterprise security team as well as us. Thanks for joining us, Keith. What do you have for us today?
Today I want to talk a little bit about some guidance that was issued by the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the disclosure of cybersecurity threats.
Okay. Well, that's going to be an interesting one. I know that's something that a lot of companies have to struggle with, so that'll be an interesting one to talk about. Also joining us today is Jim Clausing. Jim's one of our lead malware analysts. Welcome, Jim. What do you have for us today?
I've got two things I want to talk about today. The first one is an SSL denial of service tool that was released earlier this week that exploits basically a feature of the way SSL works. And I want to talk a little bit about McAfee did a blog post 2 weeks ago or so looking at 1 day of malware samples that they got in. So I wanted to look at that and then compare it to what we've seen, what we saw actually on that same day.
Great. That sounds pretty interesting. I'm interested to see how we compare with what McAfee has seen, comparison of what we see respectively. Also joining us today is Dave Gross. Dave is our senior incident response analyst with AT&T. He's also our lead for our malware analysis activities and initiatives. Hi, Dave. What topic are you going to cover today?
Well, John, what I'm going to talk about is a disclosure where it was published 210,000 Swedish login accounts and passwords, and we'll talk about where it was disclosed and it had a lot of different websites accessible, not just an individual site.
Right. Okay, good. And I'm John Hogoboom. I'm also a security analyst with AT&T and do a lot of tool development, etc. I'll be covering the Internet Weather Report at the end of the program. And if you have questions or feedback, please feel free to contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. You can also find this program online on AT&T Tech Channel. That's techchannel.att.com. As well as YouTube, and it's available on podcasts via iTunes. So let's get off with the first story here. Keith, let's get a little more detail on the SEC guidance that they're providing.
First, I hope all of you have rested up after a long cybersecurity month, awareness month, which ended in October. As part of that month, the Securities and Exchange Commission Division of Corporate Finance decided to issue a guidance document to assist publicly traded companies in assessing disclosures. In other words, they're advising publicly traded companies that in the event there are risks to your business that result from cybersecurity or cybersecurity incidents, that you need to disclose them to shareholders. The SEC was really most interested in warning companies to identify the most significant risks to their business, not merely day-to-day events, but those that might affect the value of the security on the market. And the SEC indicated that in analyzing cybersecurity risks and whether those risks should be disclosed and reported, that the company should take into account their prior experience with cyber incidents and the severity and frequency of those incidents. And they needed to consider also the probability of cybersecurity incidents occurring, both quantitatively and qualitatively, and to identify the costs and any other relevant consequences, such as the impact on their reputation or the impact on the sale of their products and services that would result from misappropriation of assets or sensitive information or corruption of data or operational disruption. And last, they identified that the company should be considering the adequacy of their preventative actions. In other words, what have they done to mitigate the risks in their businesses so as to eliminate or reduce the chance that a cyber incident could have an impact on their business. This is a pretty important step. I think most companies have always thought that cyber incidents were important, but this heightens the awareness. This heightens concern that cyber incidents are becoming more commonplace, that such incidents have a greater impact both in terms of misappropriation of assets and also in the loss of confidence by their customers. Materiality, of course, continues to be important. So, not every event necessarily needs to be disclosed, or at least that's the guidance from the SEC. It really is a balancing test. Is the risk so great that it could have an impact on consumers or on those who might purchase the stock of that company? And, what that is telling us is that companies have to more carefully forecast and estimate the impact of cybersecurity incidents, and equally important, the consequence of failing to implement adequate security. And, perhaps a side note on this is that while this is guidance, it's not a regulation, so there's not a specific requirement. But when the SEC issues guidance, there's a general expectation that it will be followed. And so security managers need to talk with their business operations managers and make sure that they have adequate budgets, adequate technology, adequate personnel to both identify cybersecurity risks and to mitigate those risks, as well as to respond on the rare occasions when they do happen. And so I do commend you, the audience, to take a look at those regulations. Be sure to talk with their lawyers. It's really important that the business operations, the management of the business, and the lawyers understand those risks. And this is a good tool to have those conversations within the business.
So, Keith, I know that there are some states that have requirements for disclosures when there is an incident. When something has occurred that users and so on be notified. This sounds like it's something where prior to something actually happening, this is an evaluation of the risk, which up until now it sounds like has really been discussion between the auditors of the company and the company itself. So is this the first time that this sort of thing is actually being made public as far as the potential risks?
Most companies know this has always been a risk to their business, so they've routinely identified it as a potential risk. The big change is by issuing guidance of this nature, they're encouraging companies to be more proactive in their disclosures. There's really three sets of rules. There's obviously more rules than that, but three ways to think about grouping the rules. Those that involve an actual incident, in which case you have breach notification obligations. Those that involve the failure of a control or the failure of a mechanism designed to prevent misappropriation of assets or access to secure information, which really are dealt with in the context of, as you said, an audit. So, for example, the old SAS 70 rules now replaced with the ISAE 16 and 3402 audit rules, which deal with whether the controls are adequate to prevent access or to prevent loss of data. And then the third is now this area, which is notify your shareholders in advance so that they can make an intelligent decision with respect to the value of the stock of the risk that might be associated or might result from a cybersecurity incident or a threat. And so that whole universe of concerns is now broadly applied to the whole cybersecurity set of concerns a business may have.
Interesting.
Yeah, now, I can't remember. I know that, like, publicly traded companies like Dave was saying, I guess in certain states they're obligated by law to notify customers. And that's on a state-by-state basis? Is that the case right now?
They are. Those requirements are state-by-state. And then there's two sets of notification requirements. One, in some states, the requirement to notify the Attorney General or an appropriate agency in a particular state. And the second would be to notify consumers of a breach.
Right.
And some states don't have regulations, and of course, a lot of states have different forms of regulation. So the concerns will vary by state.
Okay. Well, that's a good one. I know a lot of companies, struggle with when to notify, if they should notify, because it's a damaging or potentially a negative perception that they might receive in the marketplace. We know that there's been a lot of companies in the press lately that have had been breached repeatedly, and I'm not sure how that's affecting their stock or their company in general, but it's definitely something to be concerned about. So hopefully this guidance will get them prepared in the event to assess, what needs to be done.
At a minimum, it'll encourage discussion within the business.
Right.
And that's what we try to do. We try to make sure that people are appreciating the importance of cybersecurity defense mechanisms and mitigation of risk.
Okay. So let's go over to Jim. Jim, you have some stories to share with us about various malware type stuff going on and some hacker tools.
Yeah, well, the first one that I want to talk about, earlier this week, the German group called the Hacker's Choice, THC, released an SSL denial of service tool. It apparently is a tool that they've had for a while that weren't planning on making public, but it leaked out, so they decided to make it public. And what this tool does is really highlight an issue that a lot of us have known has been there for a long time, and that is the case where you can make a server, a web server, or an SSL or TLS server have to do a lot of work to start up an encrypted connection. And the part of the SSL protocol allowed for, while the stream was already established, that you could initiate a renegotiation of the keys in the encrypted connection. And this results in a lot of computation having to be done on the server, and little to none having to be done on the client. And so this is a way that a single client or a few of them can cause tremendous computational load on the server and essentially a denial of service. It's something that's been known. People who paid attention to it knew that this was an issue for a long time, but there wasn't a tool to easily exploit it until now. And there is a variation of the tool that I've seen recently that can at least check to see if your server is vulnerable without actually launching a denial of service attack against it. And that's could be useful for those of us who have to protect our infrastructures. The big problem is there are things that break if you turn off negotiation on the server, especially if you're allowing uploads or long-lasting connections. They periodically need to renegotiate, and so if you turn it off, sometimes things will break. Having said that, the folks that were studying it, in fact, I think maybe even the THC guys themselves said that they had done the study and didn't find a whole lot of cases where renegotiation was legitimately used in practice, but it turns out it's enabled by default on most web servers. And after the tool came out, I started looking around, and I couldn't find an easy way to turn it off web server that I run at home. So, one of the proposed ways of mitigating this problem is to just disable renegotiation, make the client establish a new connection rather than renegotiating the keys in the course of the existing connection. But if you can't turn it off easily in the server, I'm not sure how you'd enforce that. I suspect that we'll get some guidance from the vendors in the near future on how one would go about turning that off. But I still haven't seen any guidance. And one of the things that the group did say in their release here, and I put it up on the slide here, in general, from a cryptographic point of view, renegotiating the key material is a stupid idea. If you didn't like the key material, you should throw it all out and start over again from scratch, and not necessarily use it within the context of the existing connection. So their suggestion is also that we should ultimately turn off the renegotiation. But as I said, there are a few cases where, and there was a problem about 2 years ago, the way renegotiation was done, discovered that some applications actually broke if you turned renegotiation off. So something that we'll be having to deal with here. But this tool finally brought it out in the open, something that has been known for quite a while, and that because this causes a tremendous load on the server, it's potentially a way of causing a denial of service.
So, in a nutshell, the way this tool works, from what you said, is the client tool only needs to really make one connection to the web server, and then within that, he keeps renegotiating and tying up the web server's processing because he's doing all the work to recompute a new key.
Right. The tool establishes a connection, and then once the connection is established, it doesn't actually try to get any data. It just constantly says, we need to renegotiate the encryption keys.
Right.
And then there's another mode that the tool can be run in, a modification of it, where it does establish separate connections each time rather than trying to do it within a single connection. And that would still potentially cause issues on a server that had disabled the renegotiations. But then it starts to look just like a normal denial of service attack where you're trying to establish a lot of connections, and we've got defenses recognize that condition and potentially cut off the attacker that way.
Right, you could do some kind of connection throttling or something, for that type of scenario, right.
Been dealing with those kinds of denial of service for years and years and years, and we have created some defenses for them.
Right, and you don't need a lot of bandwidth to do this either.
Right, because all of it's a simple open the connection and then tell the server to renegotiate, and then the server has to do a lot of computation where the client just sits there and waits. And then when the server says, okay, here are the new key material, and the client says, okay, let's renegotiate it again. I don't like that. So yeah, it's not a lot of work on the client side. It's all on the server side. And I ran this tool against my home web server, and just with one laptop was able to run CPU utilization up to over 90%. Unfortunately, pretty effective.
This is the second tool we've seen within the past few months that the way they work is not to really use a lot of connections, but make one connection that does a lot of server-side computational stuff. There's that SQL injection one. For whatever reason, it's escaping me, the exact name of it, but it basically uses a benchmark function, a SQL benchmark function, in order to, make the server, the SQL server itself, do a lot of computational processing unnecessarily. So.
Right.
Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about today was a story, a blog post that McAfee did about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, looking at the number of malware samples that they get in. Since they're an antivirus vendor, obviously they get a lot more malware samples than we do. And thought it was interesting that they have now reached over 70 million samples in their database, over 71 million. In this post, they said that they get about 55,000 samples a day that they need to look at. And on October 5th, the author of this post took a look at all of the samples that they got, and on the 5th, they actually had a slow day. They only got 44,000 samples. But of those, about 3/4 of them were Trojans. About 22% were virus worms or bots, and then another 4% are the PUP, is the potentially unwanted programs. Stuff that they're not quite ready to call malicious, but things like spyware could potentially fall in that.
Adware.
Calling them pup does make them more appealing, though, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Who wouldn't want a pup?
But I thought it was interesting that almost 3/4 of the samples that they were getting were Trojans, which is modified or things masquerading as something else, some claiming to have some useful value to the program, but then hiding some malicious activity underneath. And so I decided to take a look at they further looked at those 33,000 Trojans, broke down to about 4,500 keyloggers or password stealers, 3,200 backdoors, 2,000 downloaders, and so on, down to 1,000 rootkits. So I decided to take a look at the samples that we actually got on that same day, on October 5th. And we don't get anywhere near the volume. We put 135 new samples into our malware database that day, compared to their 44,000. One of the interesting things, though, when I looked at it, of those 135, only 62 detected by antivirus software. So we got 62 samples that they recognized at the time. Now, most of them they may recognize now, but they didn't at the time that we captured them. And we're seeing a lot of the same things. We saw a lot of Trojans, some password stealers.
Backdoors?
What's that? Oh, yeah.
It's similar. We see backdoor. We see the SpyEye ZBot, which are SpyEye and Zeus, which are keyloggers. So yeah, it looks like a similar breakdown here.
Yep, some of the downloaders. This was just basically in the order that we captured them. So I didn't really take the time to calculate out the numbers and the percentages or anything, but I just thought it was an interesting look at the malware that the antivirus vendors get, and it got me thinking about what kind of stuff we get, and we seem to get, even though we don't get anywhere near the volume that they get, even in the course of our tracking and investigations, we seem to find similar things. So I just thought it was something interesting to look at.
Yeah. Can you go back to that previous slide, Jim? There's one thing that struck me about that, the breakdown. Yeah. It looks like the largest by far were keyloggers and password stealers. So it looks like a lot of the malware that's out there isn't trying to take your machine and make it part of a botnet or make it do other things. A lot of it is trying to get credentials where the attacker can use it somewhere else. That's not to say that there aren't ones that are trying to make it, password bots or something, but I just thought that was interesting to steal credentials. Well,
and this was looking at the 33,000 Trojans, or that 3/4. It wasn't really looking at this section over here, the viruses, worms, and bots. This was just primarily looking at the Trojans. So, but of the Trojans, most of them were keyloggers, password stealers, and that's some of the stuff that we're not going to see as much of, just by the nature of the stuff that we're tracking and where we get our malware samples. We're not necessarily going to see quite as many, although we'll see some. We're not going to see quite as many, quite as high a percentage as they will.
Mm-hmm. I think I had also seen that in terms of the signatures, the majority of overall signatures for antivirus have been generated in the last 2 years or something. We have a long history of running antivirus, but I think I had read somewhere where within the last 2 years they've generated the majority of the signatures.
Yeah, well, if you look back at this first graph, you can see. Now this is a cumulative total, so it's all of the previous samples are still in there, but you can see that gotten a lot more malware, ever increasing, at 8.6 million samples in Q3, Q4 of 2009, up to 12 million in Q1, Q2 of 2011. So the volumes are ever increasing.
Yep.
Anyway, I thought it was an interesting read, and I thought I'd just pass some of this information on to our viewers.
Well, yeah, I find it pretty interesting as well, and sometimes the frustrating thing about it is it's the malware that's out there. There's so much more of it than there has ever been. As you said, 55,000 samples a day. Sometimes people come to me, they say, hey, how come you don't know about this particular botnet or this command and control? And I'm like, there's 55,000 samples a day. I can only do so much in a day, you know what I mean? So it's a problem that's very difficult to deal with. Antivirus vendors like McAfee and Symantec and Norton, et cetera, I think they do a good job, and they're providing a service, but it's a challenging task for sure. Trying to keep track of it all, because there's so much that's similar to each other, et cetera, et cetera. All right, great, thanks. So I think next on the list is Dave, and Dave, you had something to share about some stolen login IDs and passwords and stuff.
Well, evidently this past week there was a disclosure of 210,000 Swedish passwords, login and password credentials This is the largest breach of Swedish accounts in history. And this 210,000 login credentials covers over 60 websites. So it's not just an individual website, it covers a number of websites, although they didn't go into what websites were actually covered by this. But this was published through a hacked Twitter account of a politician, of a Swedish politician, and basically 90,000 of the accounts were from a Swedish blog site, this blog Toppen site. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly, but anyway, that's the site that it came from. So what it seems is that some hackers had cracked into that site and then extracted the credentials there, and basically they wanted to publish this to make an example of them, saying that they're not adequately protecting the user's credential information. However, it seems that they went further than that and found that the credentials were also able to get them into other sites as well, basically saying that these were shared credentials that were not only on this blog site but on many of the other sites on the Internet. And so, the lesson learned here is you never know which sites are really going to do a good job of protecting your passwords, so you shouldn't be using the same login and password on all your sites across the Internet, because if one gets hacked, then basically the attackers can very quickly find other sites where you have accounts and get in there. So that was the story that I had found.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've seen other password lists get put out by people or other hackers, and a lot of times these people who, people have the same login ID and password. Usually it's an email address that they use as their login ID, and the password is the same for many different sites. And, I know it's a pain for people, but I recommend that you use different passwords on every site. If you can't do that, try to zone your passwords. That's kind of what I tell people who don't want to have a different password for every website. And when I say zone them, for your Facebook and for your LinkedIn and things that are not necessarily the end of the world, if somebody gets those passwords, use a password for that. For your banking sites, use a different password. And then maybe something in between there as well. Have different zones of passwords where, if you're worried about losing your Facebook password, at least they can't get into your bank account too. So I don't know. That's my recommendation, other than having different passwords for every website, which is what I do. So I don't know if anybody else had thoughts on that.
Well, I'm with you. I recommend separate passwords for everything. Yeah, they can be a pain to try to keep track of. That's why there are actually some good applications out there that allow you to manage all your passwords, because you don't want them written down on stickies next to the monitor. But there are a number of applications, LastPass, KeePass, that you can run on your smartphone, on your PDA, on your laptop, to help you keep track of those, but they stores them encrypted. So,
and then the last would be, what standard of care should an administrator have to trigger the password change? So that debate goes on quite a bit about whether administrators should force customers or force their users to change passwords with some frequency as well.
That's a good point. I actually don't know that many of the websites I use. I know internally in the company we have password expiration, but on public-facing websites, not AT&T related, I don't think I ever see them prompt me to change my password. I do on occasion, but I don't know. I can't think of any off the top of my head that I use that do, even my banking ones. So,
well, it's always the same trade-off, which is how much inconvenience do I want to create for a customer by forcing them to change a password.
How much pick off the customers and have to go someplace else.
Right.
I've got
internally we do it, for our internal systems. But you're right, customer-facing our systems are quite different.
Yeah, and sometimes the password changes generate more help desk calls too, because when you change your password, it's hard to remember it initially, and so until you get used to it, customers may have to call in and get their password reset.
While we're on the subject of passwords, another thing to be wary of is using anything or posting too much. I think we've mentioned this before, but when you use social networking sites like Facebook or LinkedIn, etc., don't post too much information about yourself on there. Because a lot of times, a lot of the websites that you use have questions like, what's my wife's name? What's my dog's name or my favorite pet, things like that. And a lot of times people will mine those social networks for that information. They'll go to the password reset page because they know your login ID on some other website, and they will be able to reset your password with their own because they know the answers to these challenge questions that some of these websites use. And it's a little bit off topic of it's based on the whole password subject. Another thing to be wary of. So, all right. So thanks for that. And now it's time for the internet weather. And so here's what we've been seeing over the past week or so. A few new things, some old favorites as we always go over. Right at the top of the list, TCP Destination Port 445, which is related to Windows file sharing, SMB type stuff. Mostly due to Conficker, although we know there's other botnets out there that are targeting and scanning on this port because of the vulnerability associated with it. There was I forget which one, MS10 something, allowed you to break into it, I think it was. In any event, so we have continued activity there. One that not quite sure what it is, ICMP type 00, which is ICMP echo responses, echo replies. And why we're seeing scanning on that, I'm not quite sure, but we'll take a look at that chart as well. TCP Destination Port 23, which is Telnet. That's an old favorite. We've been talking about that one for at least several months now. And we have I think there's some updated activity on there to take a look at. A new one that I don't think we've seen before, TCP Destination Port 389. This is some scanning activity. 389 is LDAP, by the way, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. That's used for like public key infrastructure type things or keeping track of users and keys and stuff like that, usually. And we're seeing some focused scanning of this. We'll take a look at that because that one's a little bit interesting. TCP Destination Port 5223. This one's not particularly interesting. It's pretty much benign from what I can tell. This is Apple's push notification service, or also, which is basically XMPP over SSL, I believe. When we took a look at this scanning activity, it's all to Apple. It's not really necessarily scanning. It's activity going back and forth between Apple and other devices. So we're pretty sure that that's legitimate stuff happening there. TCP Destination Port 8080, I think I have a slide on that one we'll take a look at. Probably looking for proxy servers. 8080 is an alternate port for proxies on occasion, as well as 8000. And port 1513 UDP, that one I'm also not sure of, but that's an interesting chart, so we'll take a look at that one. And TCP Destination Port 3128 to round out the grouping here, and that one is Squid proxy, probably somewhat related to some of this other 8080 scanning. Again, it's people looking for open proxies, so we'll take a look at some of these here. So first on the list, 445 TCP. We had been observing a decline. I think we had mentioned this in previous weeks, that it was kind of tailing down from what we had seen in the earlier days when Conficker was really out there, and there's still a lot of infected hosts. There still are probably 1 million infected Conficker hosts out there. However, it has been, slowing down, or they've been getting remediated, probably because machines get upgraded and they're not online anymore. That's just me guessing. in any event, we have seen an increase here. Just in the past few days, maybe the past 4 or 5 days, something like that. And it appears that these news sources, the majority of this activity is from sources in Taiwan. And when I took a look at this, it looks like the majority of these are definitely Windows machines prior to Windows 2003 or earlier. So we're talking about like Windows XP, Windows Server 2000, 2003, not Vista, not Windows 7. We can tell that because of the ephemeral ports used in the scanning. So I took a look at that, and it's a very clear delineation that these scanners are falling into that 1025 to 5000 for their ephemeral port range, which makes me pretty confident that it's older machines that are engaging in this scanning activity.
Do you have any suspicion why suddenly? Since you have a fairly long period of sustained, at least a plateau, if not a drop-off, and then all of a sudden a spike.
I'm not entirely sure, although the majority of this new activity is coming out of Taiwan. It could be a new botnet that's taken hold there that's scanning on that. Again, this is me guessing a little bit, but that would be my suspicion. Or they could be just looking for weak file sharing. I mean, there could be reasons that they're scanning for this. I would suspect that it's a coordinated type of thing. Based on the number of sources we're seeing and the way in which they act, it looks to me botnetish in that somebody's telling them to scan, at the same time as opposed to a single guy scanning at once.
That makes sense.
This one, not quite sure what to make of this. We're seeing a lot of scanning on ICMP type 0 echo replies, and we had a very, I think this is a year-long chart, and we see that there was a very low kind of plateau. And I believe we might have talked about this on previous shows over the past few weeks or so, that we've been seeing this kind of increase in activity on this. Now, why somebody would scan with a reply doesn't make sense. Doing ICMP echo requests would make some sense. When we look at this, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me right now. I need to do some more analysis here. But the thing that's a little bit alarming, in my opinion, is just within the past, 7 days or the last week or so, we're seeing a pretty significant increase in the number of sources. And again, this chart is reflecting how many sources are doing this. So we went from about, a baseline of maybe like 4,000 or 4,500 sources to about 12,000 or so. So that's like a threefold increase, pretty significant jump up, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it yet. Most of the participants, most of the scan sources here are residential or consumer type endpoints. So, your DSL, your cable providers, those types of people, probably home users, consumers. In any event, not sure what to make of this one right yet. Hopefully we'll have more information next week for you. This spike is pretty recent, so we haven't had a chance to really dig into the packets. If anybody knows what it is, please let me know. cyberthreat@list.att.com.
One of the things about echo replies is that it may also be backscatter from DOS-type activity.
I had thought about that, but when I looked at the activity, normally when it's backscatter, the source is always the same. So, a DDoS, when they're DDoSing somebody, you've got a lot of spoof source IPs, and the destination is a particular endpoint, and then the replies, like these ones, would all be sourced from that one machine that's the DDoS victim, sending back to the people who never actually sent the packets. And that's not what we're seeing in this case. We're actually seeing lots of sources doing this, 12,000 or so. So that would have to be like 12,000 simultaneous DDoS targets at once. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not quite sure. But I had thought about that as well. The next one on the list here, an old favorite, 23 TCP Telnet. We know we had mentioned this several times. We're still seeing about 80% of the sources involved in this activity are coming from Korea. it did kind of tail down, but we're starting to see a gradual increase upward again. It's not super significant, certainly not to the levels that we saw back in July, but it looks like there might be some little upward trend there. So again, as we've mentioned before, if you're running Telnet and it's exposed to the Internet, first I would ask you, are you crazy? Because why would you do that? But if you are, try to filter it, try to make sure that you have some kind of, only certain IPs are allowed to get in that way. Otherwise, I would say go with SSH. That's more secure, and also make sure you're filtering who's allowed to talk to it on that port. You should do that all the time, in my opinion, if you can, especially for services like that, where it's a remote access type of facility that allows people to interact with the machine and do things.
While the spikes were higher, it had looked like we were almost getting back to our old noise floor. The sustained levels were down near where our old noise floor was, and now we're trending back up.
Right, it seems to be perking up a little bit. So maybe next week we'll see it even higher. I hope not, but, that's kind of the trend we're seeing, so we'll see what happens next week. The next one we have, this one, 389 TCP LDAP. This is, we actually put an alert out on this one. Right now, it's very low and slow. It's not very aggressive. There is not a significant number of scan sources, about 200. I guess actually it's probably more like, what does it look like, 100 to 250 at the maximum that we see per hour. This particular activity, we know it to be specifically targeting a specific company right now. We put out an alert because they might go to your company next. I'm not going to reveal who they are at the moment. In any event, this current activity looks like it's coordinated, targeted at a specific company entity. So I would just keep an eye out. If you are running LDAP and it's exposed to the Internet, again, try to firewall it, try to do some kind of filtering to let only those devices that need to talk to that service be able to do so. And I'm not aware, I didn't really do a search, but I'm not aware of any LDAP exploits that I know of, but certainly they could try some brute forcing against it or some other types of tactics to try to mine information out of it.
There have been some, and there was just a month ago a denial of service attack against Cisco routers if you did a certain type of malformed LDAP packet through the router.
Oh, okay.
Isn't it also used by Exchange servers?
It's used as part of Active Directory.
Oh, okay. So that could be, that's a good point. So that could be what they're doing here in this case. So that's another additional thing to be on the lookout for. Good point. Very good point. This one was creeping up on the list. As you can see, there's definitely some spikes of activity here. This is actually scan packets. Scan sources shows it as well, but it doesn't really show the earlier spike at the left-hand side of the chart as well. But it's basically the same type of pattern. In any event, when we took a look at this one, first of all, 1513 UDP, I'm not quite sure what this is used for. I know that there is a gaming tool out there that uses this port for communication, but I'm not convinced that that this is related to that. It could be some kind of peer-to-peer. Anytime I see UDP, sometimes I think, well, it might be peer-to-peer. Interesting thing about this is these scanning packets, the source port, the ephemeral port on the one side is always 1513 as well, and the destination is 1513. So there must be something going on there that some service is doing that or that they're targeting. We're mostly seeing DSL-type modems, consumer-type endpoints in the United States engaged in this activity. There's quite a few of them, too, but not an extraordinary amount. So, if anybody knows what this port might be used for, what they might be targeting, please let us know. I don't know if did anybody know anything about this one on the call here? No? Okay. I didn't think so, but I hadn't found anything either. I think this might be the last one. Scanning activity on 3128 TCP. This is Squid proxy. Squid is a proxy service for web traffic. It's a very small number of sources in China, for the most part, engaging in the majority of this activity. When I say small, I mean less than 10. And they're basically scanning for open proxies, I'm pretty sure. We know China does this a lot. They have a lot of issues in their country with freedom of speech, so sometimes they're searching for alternate ways to get their message out. Open proxies is one way that they can do that via other countries. So we've seen some spikes here where they're doing some coordinated scanning at certain times of the day, where they're doing pretty aggressive scanning. I mean, it's 9 million flows an hour or so during those points that they're scanning. But I'm pretty sure that that's what that's related to. If you, again, as always, when we ever mention any of these ones that are being aggressively scanned, if you're running any types of services on your enterprise and it's exposed to the Internet, these are the ones that are probably you're going to see people scanning for as well. So be careful and try to filter them if you can.
On my home system, I often see scans for 8000, 8080, and 3128 together. It looks like this time here we've got 3128 in particular they seem to be looking for.
Right. And I thought I had a chart for 8080, which was on our initial chart there, but I must not have had time to put it together. I thought I did, but I didn't. In any event, I think I saw a similar type of pattern as well. I just didn't get a chance to put that chart together. This is the top 10 of the most probes. So this is the most number of probes in volume, but not necessarily not the number of sources doing it. I know Brian has mentioned this in the past and how this activity shakes out. So what we're seeing mostly is 445 TCP related to lot2config and other botnets scanning for, or other just botnets scanning for weak file shares that they can access and use for their purposes. 1433 TCP is Microsoft SQL Server. We've seen a recent uptick in that, and we've been talking about it. It's a very small number of sources actually engaged in this activity, but as you can see from the pie chart here, they're doing a lot of scanning on that port. The 00 ICMP is the echo reply stuff, and that we talked about. That we're not quite sure what that is, but it's taking up a large part of the wedge there. Probably, maybe 25% or something like that. 80 TCP we see all the time, people scanning for web servers. Sometimes this might be a little innocuous too, hard to tell. 8909 TCP IP, 8080 TCP IP, or TCP. Those are probably proxy servers that they're scanning for. Those are kind of well known as that. 3389 is remote desktop protocol, which we talk about often. 22 TCP is SSH, which we talk about often. So those two are giving people remote access to your devices, so they're scanning for those. And I forget what 3074 UDP is, if we even know. And 123 UDP is the time protocol. That's not really security related, as we noted here. But you see that a lot just because when devices do network time protocol syncing. As comparison, from the most sources probing, this is the number of endpoints actually out there doing the scanning, as opposed to the volume of scanning they're doing. We're seeing lots of sources doing the 445 TCP and the 00 ICMP that we talked about. And the 23 TCP Telnet and 3389 TCP are the remote access stuff there is pretty large. And I guess one thing I didn't point out is even though 23 TCP is the third most number of sources scanning it, they're doing it pretty low and slow because it doesn't even show up on this chart in terms of, or actually, I'm sorry. They're not doing a lot of probing, but there's a lot of guys doing it. So something to watch out for. 27015 UDP is gaming. That's actually not a security-related incident. And trying to see if there's any other outliers here that are interesting. 139 TCP is also related to file sharing. There's apparently a lot of sources doing it. That might not entirely be malicious scanning. I'd have to double check on that because we're not seeing a lot of scanning on it, but we're seeing a lot of sources doing it, but not a high volume of scanning activity. So that's something to consider. Again, these two at the top here, 445 TCP, 00 ICMP. The 445 TCP, we kind of understand what's going on there and why devices out on the internet would be scanning that. This ICMP echo reply scanning, I'm not quite sure. We really need to get a grip on that because it's showing up both in terms of how many sources are scanning as well as the volume of scanning. They're the top two, or actually not top two, but he's in the third spot in the volume. So that's the roundup of the internet weather.
John, I just wanted to point out that port 3074 UDP looks like it's associated with Xbox, so it may be a gaming port.
Okay. So that might be something to think about. Now, did we actually see that on both sides? No.
No, just the first one.
Right. So we see a lot of scanning on it, probably a very small number of sources doing it. And sometimes that's hard to define, especially with UDP, whether it's really scanning or if it's, for malicious purposes, or if it's just the endpoint Xbox devices trying to reach out to other peers and can't find them or whatever. But we would have to investigate that to make sure. In any event, this is, reflects a little mix of both ones that we know has some malicious intent versus ones that we're not quite. We either know they aren't or they may or may not be. So thanks for that, Dave. That's a good point. I did not know that port. So that's our cyber threat report for today. Just a final reminder, if you have questions or feedback, please contact us. Our email address is cyberthreat@list.att.com. The program's available on the AT&T Tech Channel website, which is at techchannel.att.com. And it's also available as a podcast on iTunes, and you can get it on YouTube as well. Just search for the AT&T Cyber Threat Report. So I want to say thanks to Keith, Jim, Dave, for joining me today. I'm John Hogoboom, and in the immortal words of Brian Rexroth, who I'm filling in for today, keep your network safe. Thanks for watching.